Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Very impressive that you're all here on time and you got through the security in the building, designed to keep us all safe. But often we have people streaming in late because it's hard. And I know why you came on time, and I appreciate it, and all of us appreciate it, and no doubt Steve appreciates it. So, I am Jane Harmon, the President and CEO of the Wilson Center, and thank you to all of you, and all of you from other lands who are joining us here at the Wilson Center and around the world as we celebrate the life of our dear friend and colleague, Steve McDonald. A special welcome to the members of Steve's family, his wife Renee, his sons Chris and Trevor, as well as his sister and niece and Renee's mother. Welcome here. I'd also like to welcome Steve and Renee's family, friends and colleagues in South Africa who are joining us by webcast. Hi. Hello, everybody. That's special, isn't it? Yes, it's special. Technology can be terrifying. It also can be unifying. So today we gather to honor the life of a man who dedicated himself to Africa and to honor stronger relations between the United States and the continent. We will hear from many of Steve's colleagues and friends who will attest to his huge heart, enormous energy, and enthusiasm for his work. I'd also say, as we said in the elevator, Steve was larger than life, both in terms of his impact and, at least in a prior time, his size. Many of his friends and colleagues were early in their careers when they met Steve. And as you all know, Steve always made a point of mentoring younger colleagues and helping them find their role in the Africa policy world. Steve joined the Wilson Center Africa program in 2002, the same year that his longtime friend and colleague, Congressman Howard Wolpe, took over as consulting director before transitioning to the role of director a year later. For the next 7 years, Howard and Steve shaped the Africa program into a critical part of the Wilson Center. It's still a critical part of the Wilson Center. Their contributions to peace building in conflict-affected countries in the Great Lakes region and Liberia became a hallmark of our Africa program. Beginning with the Burundi Leadership Training Program that Howard founded, Howard and Steve soon expanded to the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Liberia, where they brought together security sector forces and ordinary citizens from different perspectives and ethnic backgrounds, facilitated ceasefire commissions, demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration efforts, elections and trainings for new legislatures and political parties. That's a lot. Their deep understanding of and commitment to the continent and the people with whom they worked were at the core of their work. Steve believed in humanity, equality, and dignity of all, regardless of one's origins, and those views extended to those on the ground in Africa as well as his Wilson Center colleagues, many of whom are here today. Steve took over as the director of the Africa program in 2010 and expanded the program's reach and impact. He worked with Ambassador Alan Gulti and Ambassador Noureddin Sati to co-found the Sudan's Working Group. With the support of the Carnegie Corporation, Steve established the Southern Voices Network, a project aimed at bringing African knowledge and perspectives to inform Northern and Western policy discussions and decisions about Africa. It was important to Steve to create space for African voices to inform international policies that impacted Africa. The Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding program continues as one of the Africa program's flagship projects. In 2013, Steve became a senior fellow and then a global fellow at the center and continued to support the efforts of his brilliant and capable African-born successor, something he treasured, Dr. Monde Myangwa. And he attended, after Monde took over, many of our events. I would always see him smiling in the front row, right over there. I knew Steve was there, not just his big presence, but his big smile. I felt he supported us all the way. He left his mark on the Wilson Center at the organizational and individual levels, and the entire Wilson Center family is grateful for his kindness, for his friendship, and for his dedication to the center and our Africa program. I always say that the Wilson Center is a family. Steve was and will always be a cherished member of our family. He lives in our hearts and the hearts of so many Africans whose lives he touched. I would now like to yield the floor, or yield the podium, or yield this lovely event to Dr. Mande Miangwa for a few remarks and to introduce our speakers. Again, thank you all for coming. It means so much to have you here and to remember a great man. Mande.
Thank you, Congresswoman Harmon, for those opening remarks. And I want to add my voice to that of yours and the Wilson Center team in thanking all of you present here today for joining us to celebrate the life of our friend, Stephen McDonald. I'd also like to welcome Steve and Renee's family, friends, and colleagues joining us at the Lilithslev Foundation in South Africa, and others from around the world who are joining us via webcast. And to Renee, Chris, Trevor, Renee's mother, Jean, Steve's sister, Kathy, and Steve's niece, Emily, thank you so much for affording us this opportunity to remember and celebrate our friend and colleague, Steve. I'm going to try and keep it together, but I have my tissue here just in case I can't. I want to begin by talking about what Steve meant to the Wilson Center and to me personally. I first met Steve in the late 1990s when I moved to Washington from New Mexico. And when I look back and I think of Steve, several things jump to mind. First, I think of how much Steve loved Africa. His life and professional career were defined by his love for Africa and for Africans, and by his commitment to building stronger and more meaningful US-Africa relations. You will hear this time and again from our speakers this morning. Truth be told, many of us believe that Steve was an African at heart and in persona. Second, I think of Steve's invaluable contributions to building the Africa program here at the Wilson Center. In this regard, I join with Congresswoman Harmon in acknowledging, thanking, and honoring Gilbert Kadiagala, Congressman Wolpe, and Steve for their vision, commitment, passion, and hard work to build this program. As I look back, I believe that Howard and Steve's contributions are in the very foundation and DNA of the Wilson Center's Africa program. Their work on behalf of and with Africa was policy-driven yet practical. And the program that they built testified to their passion and commitment to working in partnership with Africans, to contributing to peace on the continent, and to improving US policy towards Africa. Through their work, the Africa program at the Wilson Center has become synonymous with peace building in Africa, a legacy that remains to this day. Their work in Burundi, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Liberia was not abstract or theoretical. It had real-life implications for ordinary citizens in those conflict-afflicted societies. And I hear from many of them as I travel across the continent. And present here today, I see many of Steve and Howard's colleagues from those efforts, and we thank you too for your contributions to building a sustainable peace in Africa. Third, I think of and honor Steve's respect for African agency. African agency is not something that's always respected in international circles. Yet Steve's work was underpinned by respect for all, and he was concerned about Africans being locked out of international decisions that impacted Africa. And he worked to create those spaces at which their voices could be heard. So his creation, and to my mind, the biggest contribution in terms of respect for African agency, is the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, or SVNP as we call it, which he founded in 2011 with the support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Almost a decade after its creation, the SVNP is a robust network of 22 African research organizations and think tanks, plus the Wilson Center, who are working to bring African knowledge and analysis to inform international policies and decision-making about Africa. I know that I speak for all 24 of the Southern Voices scholarship recipients and the 23 SVNP directors in expressing our deep gratitude to Steve for this great initiative honoring African voices. Fourth, to me, Steve was the archetype of a mentor. He was a kind man who cared greatly about those he worked with. As anyone who worked with him can attest, Steve was always generous with his time, especially to those who needed support. He was especially committed to the next generation of African leaders and Africanists. To the very end, Steve was a near permanent presence at the Wilson Center. You could find him in our offices talking to young staff members for hours on end, providing professional advice and life counsel with an unwavering dose of positivity. I always say we were the yin and yang. I was the hard-charging African mother type, coming after you and telling you to just get with it. And Steve was always so nurturing in his approach. And I thought we balanced each other well. And he always stood ready to help and support young people to expand their professional capacities. And this was no doubt the reason that he included a scholarship element in the SVNP project. And like any good African, Steve was an excellent storyteller, and we all love to listen to his stories. I know that I speak for many of our young staff members in the Africa program, the Wilson Center and beyond, in thanking Steve for being such a great mentor. Fifth, and beyond the gratitude of the Wilson Center, I want to share my personal gratitude to Steve. When I joined the Wilson Center in 2014, I knew that I had some huge shoes to try to fill. And I'm grateful to Steve for the rich inheritance of the Africa program, which has made my own work here so much easier and that much more fulfilling. I know those on whose shoulders I stand, Gilbert, Howard, and Steve, and I'm deeply grateful for the work that they did to leave us this very rich inheritance. Steve was extremely supportive from the moment I applied for the job all the way through to November 2018. In fact, the last email I received from him was October 2018. He was always ready to give advice and share ideas, to show his support by attending Africa program events and activities, conducting interviews, writing for the Africa program, and representing the Wilson Center in various fora. He always found the time to let me know he was available to assist in any way that he could. I'm especially grateful to Steve because I know transitions can be hard, especially when they involve someone that you know and respect. But Steve made this an easy transition on both the personal and professional levels, and I'm grateful to him. Sixth and finally, along with his love for Africa, which I noted at the beginning of my remarks, I want to conclude with one of Steve's most defining attributes. Steve loved people, and he was a friend to many. His personality was to include rather than exclude, to support others, and to work with others and anyone in support of the larger goal. He was always ready to give. He touched the lives of so many people in Africa, the United States, and beyond. And you will hear that from our speakers today. For my part, as my people back in Zambia would say, I conclude with this prayer. Zamaya Sinde Steve, Mulena Akupuluke. Travel well, Steve. May God keep and safeguard you. With that, let me introduce our first speaker, Ambassador Johnny Carson, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs at the Department of State. Ambassador Carson.
Thank you very much, Mondi. Renee, Trevor, and Christopher, and to all of Steve's family, friends, and former colleagues. This is indeed a very, very sad occasion, but it is also an extremely important one. This is an opportunity for all of us to celebrate the many contributions Steve made on his journey through life. Steve was an outstanding person, certainly one of the most talented and thoughtful individuals I've known. He was smart, well-read, street savvy, and policy wise. He was also an extraordinarily decent man, gentle, gregarious, and always fun-loving. A man who rarely forgot a face or a name. A man who treated everyone with kindness, dignity, and respect. And a man who valued, nurtured, and constantly renewed the friendships that he made. Our personal friendship spanned over 4 decades and 3 continents, and was built around our passion for politics, our deep love for Africa, and our strong commitment to fairness for everyone. We were also bound together by other things. Our love of music, sports, fast cars, and good beer. Anyone who knew us in our earlier days would frequently find us playing basketball after work at the YMCA, or on weekends at Blues Alley in Georgetown, listening to great music. Steve was a little smaller then and much more faster than you might think. Steve was one of my very, very best friends, and it was always stimulating to be around him. Steve and I come from very, very different backgrounds, but we met here in Washington as young Foreign Service officers in the early 1970s. We worked together closely for several years on southern Rhodesia and on the Portuguese territories of Angola and Mozambique. Following our tours in D.C., the State Department, with all of its generosity, sent us both off to London for advanced studies and degrees in Africa. Following that, Steve was assigned to the embassy in Pretoria, South Africa, and I was posted next door at the embassy in Mozambique. Our friendship continued and grew in Southern Africa, And my wife and I were regular guests at Steve's home in Pretoria every time that we could escape from Mozambique. Steve did an extraordinary job in South Africa, and the work he did to foster political equality and to end apartheid has sometimes been overshadowed by the enormously good work that he did in peace building in Burundi, the Great Lakes, the Congo, and Liberia. But his early work in South Africa should not be forgotten. It defined him and set him on a peace journey that he took with him across Africa, building reconciliation, building peace in the most strife-torn of African countries. But his years in South Africa made him who he was. It defined him for the future. During his 3 years in Pretoria, Steve had the most difficult job in the political section, if not the entire embassy, and he excelled at what he did. He was responsible for meeting and talking with South Africa's young black political leaders and trade unionists, and reporting generally on black politics in the townships of Mamelodi and Alexandria and Soweto. Much of what he did was against South African law at the time. It required great personal courage and extraordinary interpersonal skills. He skirted South Africa's legalized system of apartheid to meet with black leaders in the townships and the homelands. And he gained the trust of many African nationalists suspicious of America's policies at the time. Inside the embassy, he was just as active, urging that more pressure be put on South Africa to change its policies and its politics, and that more be done to assist the country's black majority to achieve their rights. Steve was trusted by black leaders. He became very close with Steve Biko, the young leader of the Black Consciousness Movement, whose brutal murder at the hands of South African police led to the student protests and student boycotts that ultimately brought down the apartheid regime. Biko's death, which Steve thought could have been prevented, had a significant emotional impact on him. He thought the U.S. government could have done more and said more in the face of South Africa's growing repression at the time. Biko's tragic death and the conservative policies being pursued by the United States at that time weighed heavily on Steve and contributed to the decision he would soon take to resign from the State Department. Although Steve left government after his service in Pretoria, he did not abandon his interest in Africa or his commitment to try to end apartheid in South Africa. Steve took on the position as executive director at the United States South African Leader Exchange Program, a private foundation that promoted racial dialogue in South Africa and exchange programs for black and white South Africans in the United States. Steve also wrote widely on Southern African affairs and quickly established himself as a leading American authority on black politics in that country. His scholarly articles remain an important contribution to our understanding of South Africa in the 1970s and the 1980s. During that period, Steve also served as a consultant and a contributor to a major study on South Africa by the Ford Foundation. That study increased American awareness of the injustices of apartheid and sparked congressional efforts to impose the first political and economic sanctions on South Africa. Steve's views were sought on Capitol Hill, and his ideas helped shape the sanctions legislation that was ultimately passed in 1981. As apartheid ended, Steve expanded his activities into other parts of Africa, moving increasingly into the domain of trying to build peace and reconciliation in conflict areas. But many of the things that made Steve such a wonderful friend and colleague during those early years remained very much a part of his life until the very end. As we've heard, he was passionate. He was passionate about Africa and particularly passionate about South Africa. He cared about people, and he developed deep and long-lasting friendships. That's reflected in this room. He remained devoted to his music, singing and playing his guitar and writing musical tunes. He continued to write, not just about politics and economics. He was, for those who knew him, a very wonderful and gifted poet. He loved the cadence of a well-written sentence. And yes, until his illness robbed him of his sense of taste, Steve loved to eat. And he bragged proudly. He bragged proudly about Renee's fabulous cooking. And all of us, and there are a few who played poker from South Africa to Washington, to his farm in Virginia, know how fabulous the cooking really is. But we also know that Steve loved to cook. And anytime he could start a fire on a grill anywhere, and especially the one at his farm, he became the master chef. From the beginning to the end, Steve was a man of many, many talents. Whether you knew him as a professional diplomat, an anti-apartheid activist, or an African program director, or as a man sitting in front of his shiny maroon Corvette, strumming his guitar or playing poker with a half a dozen of his close friends in this room. We can remember him as an incredibly decent man of boundless optimism, enduring hope, and a man who never lost faith in Africa or the kindness of the person next to him. Renee and Trevor and Chris, you have lost a loving husband and a remarkable father. For everyone else in this room and listening, we have lost a remarkable and irreplaceable friend. We mourn with you. We extend our prayers and best wishes to you, but we celebrate his life for all of us. For his having been here has made us all a little bit better. Thank you.
I'd now like to invite Ms. Vivian Lowery Derryck to offer some remarks. Vivian?
Good morning, everyone. We are here to celebrate a remarkable man. So to Renee and Chris and Trevor and to Mondi and the Wilson Center, I want to give tribute to you and celebrate Steve. Steve ambled into my life in 1992 when, as the president of the African American Institute, I was interviewing for a new executive vice president. I knew immediately that this huggable teddy bear of a man, a seasoned Africa hand, would be a perfect partner. And for the next 6 years, we were a team focused on Africa's new democracies and abolishing apartheid. We contributed to and witnessed Nelson Mandela's release from prison, the historic 1994 South African elections, Namibian independence, the seismic shift from one-party states to multi-party democracies. We both eventually left AAI, but we stayed in touch, collaborating on programs, especially during Steve's years at the Wilson Center, where his work with Howard Wolpe on Burundi established the gold standard for sustained conflict resolution attempts and peace-building initiatives. And both Jane Harmon and Mondi and Johnny have all commented on this, and I think it's going to be a theme as we go through, because their work was absolutely seminal, and everything since has been informed by it. 8 years ago, I started the Africa Policy Group, a group of senior Africa specialists which meets periodically to discuss major African events, and then we share our thoughts with senior U.S. officials. Steve was an active and enthusiastic charter member of the group, and we looked forward to his cogent, carefully reasoned analyses, and his writing skills invariably improved our recommendations. I remember one phrase that he just quickly changed and added the words refreshed, and many of you in the room are members of this group, and it just made all the difference. So he was just an extraordinary writer. Because he was revered, Steve led the group to realize that the APG had become a family, and we've talked about family with Steve and how he was so good at building it. His passing deepened that sense of family and leaves within that group a really huge void. When I think of Steve, 3 images flash through my mind. The first is his commitment to family and to friends, and especially his love for Renee. And I remember their wedding and the palpable joy that we all felt and the love that we felt on that snowy, wintry night. So celebrate that and cherish it as we all do, Renee. Steve also loved and embraced his wider family, sharing stories that brought his world of Africa into their living rooms. And he made that world real to all of you. And I think that that was extraordinarily special, because in that way, your perspective and his perspective melded in love. The second image involves Steve in his professional life as a diplomat, as a journalist, as an activist, and as a nonprofit executive. Steve and I shared a passion for promoting democracy, so we were elated when so many African nations moved from being one-party states to multi-party democracies in the early 1990s. Steve was privileged to lead an AAI observer delegation to several referenda and elections, but especially the highly fraught referendum in Eritrea, the referendum for independence. And therein hangs the story. So as AAI's EVP, Steve was leading the AAI delegation when the group was caught up in a demonstration in an Addis Ababa stadium and falsely accused of bias. It was so bad that one of our group leaders was even declared persona non grata. So this is serious. And it was a serious situation which caused a lot of international hand-wringing, and especially back in New York. But I wasn't too worried because I knew that Steve would find a diplomatic way out of the situation. He did. The referendum occurred without a hitch, and Eritrea became an independent nation, with AAI credited by some as the mother of Eritrean independence. So afterwards, I peppered Steve with questions, but he never told me how he pulled that off. My third image of Steve involves his commitment not only to racial equality, but to intellectual equality with Africans. And I think Mondi just so brilliantly spoke of that and framed it. But it was just something that was constantly visible with Steve. And I reflect on his friendship with Steve Biko and the depth of his belief in colorblind racial equality. I also reflect on his belief in Africa's robust intellectual capital. Again, as has been said, as I remember him moderating a panel of African scholars on economic issues, and also his work on Burundi. And I just have these pictures of him meeting with Africans and listening carefully. You know, listening is so important, and forming policies in relationship to Africans. As a Black American, I come from a long line of independent spirits. My great-grandfather was born in 1829, was walked from Virginia to Georgia in chains. He and my family fought for freedom, and they survived slavery, and they faced down the vicissitudes of Reconstruction and Jim Crow. So I know that when I see these elders, they're going to ask me, how did I use my freedom, the freedom that they worked so hard to secure? So now it's a question that I ask of people that I hold close, like I held Steve close. So Steve used his freedom to model love. Love for Renee, love for his close-knit family, for friends that he gathered and cherished. Steve used his freedom to build a constituency for Africa and to promote racial justice and equality between the races. He used his freedom to build peace. In closing, I reflect on what the ancient Greeks believed. They believed that the greatest of virtues is magnanimity, greatness of spirit. And that Steve, this huggable teddy bear of a great talent, a great intellect, great compassion, and great integrity. He used his freedom to literally make the world a better place. I thank you.
Thank you so much to both Ambassador Carson and Vivian, Lowery, Derryck. As you know, this memorial is a joint partnership between the Lily Slave Foundation and the Wilson Center. So I would now like to turn it over to the Liliesleaf Foundation in South Africa to help us celebrate and remember Steve. I'd like to welcome Mr. Nick Wolpe, the CEO of the Liliesleaf Trust. Nick, thank you so much for everything. The mic is now yours.
Thank you very much, Marty. Renee, Christopher, on behalf of the Lilies South Africa. I think one of the ways for it to see, one is I would like some Steve and his commitment to South Africa by using the word that we South African help back to some of the slides of this.
Hey, Nick, can you hold on a second? You're breaking up on us. Can you use the mic, please? That's what we're being advised. Get it up close to you.
If I put it any closer, I think it would land up in my mouth.
All right, so I got wrong information.
I can try and put it a bit closer, but I'm worried I may swallow it.
Okay.
Is that better? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So what I was saying is that Steve represented a true son of the African soil. And the support and help he gave to the Liliesleaf Trust really symbolizes everything that all the speakers have said that went before me. He was a genuine human being. A human being who was committed to not only the continuation of our story, because let's be aware that our struggles on one level, the road had not been fully achieved. We had gone through toil and a lot of problems, 9+ years. His commitment that he showed out to the United States, Washington, D.C., highlighted how he was to ensure the liberation struggle that were fulfilled. He also personified freedom. He also personified the selfless sacrifice to what we were trying to achieve. Always willing to help, always willing to support us in our cause, to support the message that the Liliesleaf Trust was trying to make, not only in the United States, but around the world, that South Africa will be a true non-racial society. And he showed that in through the support that he honor and a privilege to be see how he was always to assist us, to help, to deliver that message. What a unique individual was willing to go beyond the call, to assist. So from the point of view of Liliesleaf, it was a great honor and a privilege to be associated with it and to have shared dream with you.
Thank you, Nick. We got about half of that, but I think the sentiment was very clear. So thank you so much. Our next speaker from South Africa is Mr. Gabi Magamola, owner and director of Summer Place Boutique Hotel and prisoner number 83763, Robben Islands, South Africa. And this speaks to what Ambassador Carson was talking about in terms of Steve's legacy in South Africa. Gabi, we're going to try you next. Please hold the mic as close as possible to your mouth. If you break up, I have your remarks here, so I will go ahead and read them if we can't hear you clearly. Is that okay?
That's fine. That is fine.
All right, Gabi, over to you then.
Thank you very much. And I have these remarks to make about this appointment. The passing of Steve has, in my view, achieved of a dedicated and patriot with a continent as his second hope. I can attest to this as one close to Steve during days as he was to me during times of triumph and joy. I met Steve for the first time in 1975, shortly after my release.
Gabby, sorry to break you up. You are still breaking up. So.
Okay, can you hear me better now?
Yeah, can you speak a little bit slowly? Let's try that.
Okay. Well, I met Steve for the first time in 1975 as a young detainee who had just been released from Robben Island. And he was at the time a political officer at the United States Embassy in Pretoria. And little did I know at the time that I was running into someone who would be a lifetime friend and brother. Little did I know that this is a man who would help determine the trajectory of my life, a journey that would transform me from a little-known former youth prisoner in South Africa's notorious Robben Island prison to a figure that many would look up to as a leader in his own country. I am privileged to be one of those who counted on you, Steve, as a friend and advisor, and I thank Renee and children for giving you honor, love, and happiness. In the presence of this august transatlantic audience, I pay tribute to you, Steve, for helping to lift me and my family out of the tight jaws of South Africa's repressive laws soon after my release from a jail cell on Robben Island. I also thank you, Steve, for the dedicated support in my quest to becoming a Fulbright scholar in your country, and later with your assistance and support, an accomplished banker and businessman. Your indomitable bravery in venturing into our tough, segregated townships here in South Africa, often in the heat of the night, brought hope to many black South Africans who have been robbed of their self-worth as human beings because of the repressive apartheid regime. Thanks for your friendship. In the presence of all of you here, Gigi, Bobby, Joanna, I remember when we were at Renee's house at one stage where Steve cooked up a real storm for us in support of what the ambassador said. I'm very, very thankful for being honored to speak at this memorial of yours. Go well, my friend. I will miss you, your friendly, dimpled face. I will miss your mischievous eyes on your brow. I will miss your big, robust laughter and your huge heart, and of course the hogging of the beer. It was nice to have met you in this part of the world.
Thank you so much, Gabby. We got most of that, and we appreciate your taking the time to work through this with us. So our next speaker will be Mr. Gabi Magamola, the owner and director of the, I am getting confused now. I apologize. Our final speaker from South Africa today, who also met Steve during the fight against apartheid, is Mr. Papi Molasane, the CEO of Resource Generation Limited and a former student activist in South Africa. Papi, I'm turning it over to you. Speak slowly and into the mic. Over to you, Papi.
Thank you, Monde. Distinguished guests, the dusty townships of Attersville in Pretoria, where I come from, produce many intellectuals, many professionals, and top corporate executives against all odds. Like many black townships in South Africa, political activism among young students was the order of the day around 76. And the uprising of June 1976 actually happened during Steve's tenure in South Africa. I was a young student activist at that time, like many others who were determined to see the eradication of apartheid. It was indeed during those dark days of our struggle against subjugation that I met Steve McDonald, who was a political attaché at the US Embassy in Pretoria. I have known Steve actually for more than 4 decades. During my detention under Section 6 of the Terrorism Act at the age of 17, Steve intervened on behalf of my mother, who was at the time in the US. He challenged Jim Kruger, the Minister of Justice, about the legitimacy of incarcerating a 17-year-old young man in solitary confinement. I was held in solitary confinement for 210 days. During my incarceration, my mother, and at the time a lady called Shelley Cooks, who used to work for the African American Institute and Henry Belafonte's sister, were actually planning to get me out of South Africa to come and study in the US. I eventually left South Africa in 1978. I obtained an engineering and business degree in the US, and that helped me enter the corporate world, and it actually paved my way to eventually reaching the pinnacle of the corporate world as the chief executive of a dual-listed company on the New York Stock Exchange and on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Now, can you imagine this, that the young township boy who rose like a phoenix, who stood on shoulders of giants like Steve McDonald, who were indeed the wind beneath his wings. I'm privileged to have known Steve, whose love for Africa was unparalleled. His razor-sharp and enduring intellect made him a sought-after speaker and a marvel to listen to. His wealth of knowledge inspired many, including my very own family, my wife Johanna, my daughter Jacqueline, and later my son-in-law Jeremy, who were always mesmerized by Uncle Steve's larger-than-life character. My grandmother called Steve his son, and I vividly remember Steve showing me a plastic mat that my grandmother made for him, which was hanging in his house in Washington, D.C. He was indeed in his element when visiting my grandmother in Antigua and enjoying a braai with friends, which he insisted on cooking. I am indeed privileged to have known Steve, privileged to have seen his unflinching love to his wife Renee, who delivered my daughter in Washington, D.C., privileged to have seen his love for his 2 sons, Chris and Trevor, and love for his family. Renee, Chris, and Trevor, that's the Steve I know. Steve McDonald, your memory will forever be embedded in my heart and will forever remain part of my family. Thank you.
Papi, thank you so much. And for what it's worth, Shirley Cooks is sitting right here in this memorial. So she heard you, and I know I speak for her when I say she appreciates the acknowledgement. So thank you. And to all of you, Nick, Gabby, Papi, as well as everybody in South Africa, thank you so much for patching in and helping us to remember and celebrate our good friend and colleague, Steve. For now, we're just going to share a very short video. Are we ready for it or no? We are? Okay. Let me invite Dr. Liz McClintock to speak to us. She is the founder and partner of CMP Partners and a former colleague of Steve's here at the Wilson Center. Liz?
Good morning. Thank you, Monday. Renee, Chris, and Trevor, it's a real privilege to be here today to offer some remarks in memory of Steve. I had the honor of working with Steve for about 15 years. He was sometimes my boss. He was generally always my mentor. He was a wonderful collaborator. Most importantly, though, as has been said many times here, he became my lifelong friend. I met Steve when he called to invite me to a meeting with him and with Howard Wolpe to discuss the possibility of joining their team to create a new kind of peace-building program in Burundi. As an aside, on the telephone, Steve had this very deep and resonant voice. So little did I know at the time that I would have the privilege of hearing that beautiful voice in song many times over the 15 years that we worked together. But in any case, when I got that call, I realized I'd heard of Howard. He had been President Clinton's special envoy. You know, he'd had this earlier role, as very important one, as co-author of the legislation that imposed sanctions on South Africa. However, I'd not heard Steve's name before that day. Now, that's, you know, betrays my own ignorance, of course, because this was an important expert on African issues. However, as I came to learn and I came to cherish in Steve, the fact that I didn't immediately recognize his name revealed an incredibly important aspect about his character. Steve made things happen, but Steve rarely sought the spotlight himself. He guided, he encouraged, he cajoled, he sometimes even commanded, as some of us here know. But he made things happen not by tooting his own horn, but by creating the conditions for others to succeed. Steve was a man of action, yet he often was so humble, you frequently thought you organized that initiative or that program all on your own. There's one story in particular that reflects this part of Steve's character for me. You've heard a little bit about the Burundi Leadership Training Program, and this happened during our first workshop. The BLTP was designed to bring together a cohesive and sustainable network of 100 key leaders who would be capable of working across ethnic and conflict lines in Burundi in the aftermath of their civil war. It's important to remember that when we started the program, while the Arusha Peace Accord had been signed, the ceasefire agreement with the largest remaining rebel group had not yet been signed. So given this situation, participating in our program was considered extremely dangerous. Not only did the participants need to travel to the workshop site in armored vehicles through territory still controlled by rebels, a number of participants brought their bodyguards with them, and these are participants from different sides of the conflict. We had almost as many bodyguards as participants during that first meeting. And then, in addition, we had a whole contingent of UN soldiers who were charged with securing this peace process and protecting our participants. And some of these participants had come back to Burundi for the first time in 30 years just to participate in the program that Howard and Steve had invited them to. So as you can imagine, the presence of all these soldiers presented a somewhat serious challenge to crafting that sort of context that we wanted for creating trust and building peace across conflict lines. This was especially problematic because the UN soldiers in particular insisted on being present inside the training room fully armed. Now, I have to say, I didn't know about all these challenges at the time. I was somewhat oblivious, really focused on those last-minute details that go into a training. I was working feverishly with Howard, with our colleague Alain. We were trying to make sure everything was in place before the program began. This problem that the soldiers presented had to be solved by Steve and our colleague Nicole. This was no easy task. The UN governed the space in which we were working. We had to abide by their rules. Steve had both an immediate problem, what are we doing with these UN soldiers, but then a long-term challenge, how to pay for feeding all of those bodyguards and kind of additional members of the team. And as anyone who's run an international program knows, donors do not look kindly on those kinds of budget overruns. So behind the scenes, Steve negotiated with the UN to make sure that all of the interests were respected. He worked with the town of Ngozi. They set up a secure perimeter around the facility, alleviating the need for the soldiers with guns to be standing in the corners of our training room. He reached out to the donor and other UN agencies to cover the costs of feeding all those soldiers. And this was especially critical. You definitely don't want hungry and unhappy soldiers from different sides of the conflict looking at each other on your workshop site for 6 days. That's not a good situation. But true to form, Steve had quietly resolved several key issues that could have easily derailed at any moment our entire program. This was our first visit to Burundi to work with these 100 key leaders. And the rest of us didn't really learn about any of his efforts until later. As I witnessed Steve in action over the years, I came to deeply respect his profound commitment to furthering the goals of peace, justice, and reconciliation in Africa, and his equally deep and personal commitment to its peoples. Steve's relationships, just as here at the Wilson Center, with soldiers, politicians, peace builders, ordinary citizens, they created enduring friendships, and they reflected his strong belief in how effective communication, negotiation, conflict management skills can contribute to turning a piece of paper, like the Arusha Accord, into a sustainable peace-building process for an entire nation. As we've heard here today, my work with Steve was just one chapter of his incredible life. That life story has produced a legacy that will live on in each of us. One of the most important lessons that Steve taught me is that a life well lived is not represented by finding the spotlight. Rather, it's demonstrated by the positive change we inspire in others. So thank you, Steve, for inspiring me. I love and miss you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was beautiful and added to the already wonderful remembrances of good friend and colleague Steve that have been offered here this morning. We wanted to conclude this session of remembrances hearing from a final group of speakers of current Wilson Center staff and slightly former Wilson Center staff to just give us their reflections on what Steve meant to them. Steve was more than just the Africa program. You could find him in all corners of this building. So let me call up Mr. Mike Jobbins, Senior Director, Partnerships and Engagement at the Search for Common Ground and a former program associate at the Africa program. Lindsay Collins, Information Receptionist at the Wilson Center. Maria Stella, Special Events Coordinator here at the Wilson Center. And Mr. Gentry Artis, Security Officer assigned to the Wilson Center. Ladies and gentlemen, please.
Steve and Howard Wolpe were my first bosses when I came to Washington 14 years ago. I was a string of Africa program assistants sitting, the four of us, Howard, Steve, Nicole, and I, sitting in a room, Howard's one-room office next to the third-floor bathrooms, a couple floors down from here. It was my first real job at all. And like many before and many since, Steve shaped my understanding of Africa, Washington, and what a career and what a life ought to be. Dozens of us, ex-interns, ex-staffers, colleagues like Liz, like colleagues across Burundi and Congo would say the same. A lot of us came up under Steve and Howard's mentorship, and I see many here. Doreen, Rosalind, Sarah, I know Nat Jackson is watching our webcast, and maybe many more. What struck me most, as some of the other speakers have remarked, was Steve's authenticity and his enthusiasm for Africa, for the U.S., and for everything that he ever touched. I don't think whether it was land reform in Malawi to food security in Zimbabwe or Mauritania, he was engaged in every single project that he touched at the Wilson Center. And that passion, that love, and that integrity were something that I'll carry with me going forward, and I think it's the highest that anyone can aspire to in the Africa policy world or in any aspect of life here in DC. But especially his deep care for people, including and maybe especially the young people that he worked with. was maybe his biggest legacy, at least in my life. He took everyone seriously, even recently arrived 22-year-olds, offering advice, experience, perspective, jokes, reminiscences. And, when my then girlfriend and now wife got her first job working on Liberia for DAI, Steve took her out to lunch, and it was probably one of the first people to treat her as a peer, and it meant a lot to me, it meant a lot to her. And I think similar experiences meant a lot to just about everyone who had the pleasure of coming up under his mentorship. When we talk about Steve's legacy, his impact in the U.S. and in Africa are written in history books. From Professor Whitman's Outsmarting Apartheid to Dr. Campbell's recent Breaking the Rules to Build Peace, chronicling the work that he and Howard did in Burundi. His legacy will live on bookshelves. But more importantly, and for me, and I suspect many of us in the room, and many of us sort of once young people who came up under his mentorship, it'll remain in how he influenced all of our lives through his career, in our careers, through his advice, but more importantly, through his example. I count myself deeply fortunate to have come up under Steve here at the Wilson Center, and I know that many of us feel the same. And I hope that through the lives and the careers that we lead and continue to lead for the decades to come, that'll continue to do a credit to him, do a credit to Howard, and do a credit to the values around which they built and lived their lives.
I first met Steve McDonald when he arrived at the Wilson Center in 2002. As people have said before, Steve was a master storyteller. Whenever he arrived at the center, he'd take time to sit with me at the reception area on the sofas and talk about his life. He could transport me back into the 60s and 70s with stories about his playing in lively jam sessions with famous American folk musicians. Minutes later, I'd be a virtual observer in the middle of one of his peace-building sessions in Burundi. Steve's love for his family was obvious, and he often boasted about his beloved Renee's countless artistic talents. I've seen many examples myself, and the expert care she gave him during his cancer convalescence. He told me that Renee's constant encouragement and gentle nudging were what kept him determined to get up and moving even on the most challenging of days. When it became too difficult for Steve to engage in his gardening hobby, which he loved so much, he didn't complain, but accepted his physical limitations with grace. As a matter of fact, the only time I heard him complain was when he had said his medical protocol didn't allow him to drink wine, and we know that Steve did love an occasional glass of good fine wine. The last email I received from my friend came last October 17th. Always a positive person, Steve said, "Yeah, Lindsay, I'm comfortable. They have me on pain medication, and so no problems there. I'm getting my strength back pretty quickly, so hopefully we'll be no more than a few more days at hospital and maybe a week or so in rehab. We'll see, but no cartwheels for either of us. No guarantees, but moving along quickly, Steve." I miss Steve's vibrant presence, his generous nature, and especially his stories. Thank you.
So I had the privilege to know Steve McDonald as a friend, as a colleague too, but mostly as a friend. And during my first conversations with him, I realized immediately that he and I were kindred spirits. We were different in age, different in career path, but we were both people who lead with the heart. And all of our conversations, immediately we knew we were like each other. He would tell me a lot of stories about the people that he cared for, about Africa, and most of his stories with me were about the people and the land rather than his accomplishments, which I knew that were many. But we really connected, and we understood each other, and we talked about service, the importance of love, and the joy that we get, in my career and his career, the joy that we get because we have a chance to love people and a chance to be of service. And that was really special to meet someone like that. One of the early stories that he told me about Africa, he was a young diplomat. He was about to have his first posting overseas. So he was given a choice between Paris, France, or Uganda. So immediately he said he was excited about Paris. It was glamorous. Who wouldn't want to go to Paris? And then his advisor told him, but Steve, if you go to Paris, you're going to be one of many in an office, and you're going to be covering very minor issues like leftist student demonstrations. But if you go to Uganda, you're going to have a chance to be one of 3 foreign service officers. You're going to have a chance to be on the ground and really get to know people and do things. So he chose Uganda, and he said that the rest is history. He fell in love with the continent, the land, and its people. And he really did. He really did love the people. And as his career attests, he spent his life doing peace building and bringing education about Africa. So for me, he was a mentor. He was a great human being, but he showed me that a person of the heart can also be a successful person. So I'm very grateful to Steve, and I will remember him always for that.
First, I would like to thank everyone who came out to commemorate this celebration of life, and the members of the Africa program. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak. Steve was genuine. And if I could describe him in one word, I would say he was genuine. So I looked up the definition of that word. It says, truly what something, or in this case, what someone is said to be. Other words describe that definition is authentic, real, actual, true, or original. And that's the kind of guy he was. If you talked to Steve for 5 minutes, you understood that you were dealing with an authentic person whose career and family meant a lot to him. He didn't just work here. I remember when he would arrive to work, and I would say, "Good morning, Steve. How are you doing?" And he would reply, "Better than what they say I am." And I thought to myself, wow, he is a man's faith in his heart, and it always comes out of his mouth no matter what the circumstances look like. Real, actual, true, original. Those words just continue to describe a man that meant so much to so many people. Steve was someone who always had a smile on his face and a positive outlook on things. Steve was a guy with a heart for people. He inspired us all every time we came in contact with him. So I wanted to break those words down. Real, family man. True, inspiration. Actual, man of faith. Original, one of a kind. That was Steve McDonald. You'll be truly missed.
I'm going to give you all a hug. Don't go. Maria Stella, thank you. Mike, Lindsay, Maria Stella, artist, thank you so much. We could have gone on and just made this memorial from the Wilson Center. I look out in the audience and I see members of the Wilson Center leadership team. I see Steve's former colleagues as directors. I see people from various departments and offices at the Wilson Center, from IT to the financial management office to the security office. And all corners of the Wilson Center are represented in this memorial today. And that, to me, I think is testament to what Steve meant to this organization and to how grateful the Wilson Center is for his contributions. So thank you so much to all of you for helping us remember Steve. Now, when I got here, one of the things that someone said to me was, "Are you going to sing at the Christmas party?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" They're like, oh, Steve always sang at the Christmas party. And I was like, I cannot sing to save my life, so you just count me out for now. So I just want to break for 2 minutes for video tribute to Steve. Christmas party video that we have of Steve singing at one of the parties. And Ali, I don't know if you've patched in by webcast in Argentina, but you're on too. So webcast, please.
Long time coming, but I know change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. There were times when I thought I couldn't last for long, but now I know that I am able to carry on. It's been a long, long time coming, but I know change gonna come. Argentina, here I
Let me transition very quickly. As I was saying, we heard from a number of Wilson Center staff. We have many other people who could have gotten up here to speak and to remember Steve. And I just wanted to conclude our remembrance of Steve with this one slide. Could I have the slide, please? All right. So when I got the news that Steve had passed, I thought one of the things I would do is go around the building and ask people one very simple question, or what I thought would be a very simple question. When I mentioned Steve, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? And these are the responses that I got from people around this building. Now remember, Steve passed in November. We had a government shutdown in December and most of January. So I wasn't able to get to everybody. But this slide is as full as it is, shows you just how much Steve meant to the Wilson Center. So let me just read the feedback that I got about what Steve meant to the people at the Wilson Center. Big heart, peace builder, good friend, way down to earth, Africa, African, serious love for Africa, mentor, sincere, respect, approachable, ebullient, infectious smile and laughter, social justice, music. He knew Roberta Flack, someone has claimed. Christmas party, humility, equality, huge embrace, passionate about his work and the people he worked with, supporter, supportive, nice man, respect for all, happy, deep, inclusive, humble, laughter from deep down. He cared about his work and each person that he worked with. He remembered names and the things that mattered to each person. Passionate, dynamic, and multifaceted. The Vietnam Studies and Operations Group, so dear to me. Great storyteller, doer, generous, practical, fighter for good, humanity, warm aura, positive. And one thing I heard time and time again was he made time for everyone. This is a slide that could have gone on and on and on. And I know you all see some of your relationship with Steve in that slide, and I know all of you would have added something to that slide. So I just wanted to leave that with you as an encapsulation and highlights of what Steve meant to the Wilson Center and his contributions to this organization. So Renee, Chris, Trevor, thank you so much for sharing your father and your husband with us. We are grateful for everything that he brought to the Wilson Center, to Africa. We are grateful for the many lives that he touched in this building, on the continent, and beyond. And we will remember him forever. So thank you so much. As we conclude, I would now like to invite Chris to speak on behalf of the family.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Wilson Center, to Congressman Harmon, to Mondi, to Vivian, to Johnny, to Nicholas, Gabby, Poppy, Liz, Francis. I use those names primarily because this is personal. Everything was personal for my dad when it related to Africa. So I was a little concerned at first about my prepared remarks because this is what I shared at the family memorial. So I was worried it would be too personal, but it all was very personal to him. So I do think they're appropriate. So I am a crier in the family, so I apologize in advance if I don't get through this without doing so, but I wanted to share a bit of what he meant to us in the family. Also, thanks to the extended family that's in South Africa joining. Good to see you. Wish we could have seen you in person, but thank you for coming. A special thanks to Renee, because she gave us an irreplaceable gift that was given to me and to my brother, to my family, to my kids. Without Renee's unwavering commitment and love for my dad, through some of his darkest moments, I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that we would not have made it this far. My dad did have extremely strong willpower, and most things non-snack food or cookie related, that is. But he also had a very strong stubborn streak as well. These last 5 years, it was Renee that was his best advocate against an overwhelming sea of medical terms, varying diagnoses, recommendations. It was Renee who he knew was his soulmate. It was Renee who he knew had nothing but his best interests in mind. And it was Renee who was his #1 cheerleader. And it was Renee who was the source of hope that kept him fighting every day to beat the heavy odds against him. So for all this extra time, Renee, we thank you. As we've heard also a stream, my dad was not just a scholar, but he loved the spoken word, which included poetry, writing songs. So I wanted to include also one of his poems as part of this. It's one of his most recent ones. It's titled Thoughts Before Surgery. And this was actually his first surgery back on August 28th, 2014. If one were to define a life well lived, one would have to do so in the shadow of that life's ending. Only then can we see the breadth, the warp and weave of the fabric, and see if the pieces of the quilt fit together in the long term. My life's work, seen through these eyes, seems a pretty coordinated and spaced gathering of fabrics, of multicolored, associated, assorted textures, and sometimes jarring contrasts, but a finished quilt that sits easy on the eye of the viewer. It is no accident that the analogy for my life is a quilt, because quilts are one of the great passions of the woman who was the object of my great passion and love, and brought true meaning and fulfillment to this life. Renee entered the scenario just when I was in danger of wandering off track, losing a sense of color and content, composition, and coordination. She gave all that to me and so much more. To be truly loved is a goal common to all religions, theologies, and belief systems, but one not easily attained. And again, maybe it takes the approaching end of life to fully gauge the depths of that love, so often declared but now sharpened and defined, as we truly bond as a couple to face the obstacles together and share the profundity and intensity of the pain and passion of those moments. Because of that lifelong intensity of physical and emotional connections between the two, the passion overrides any agony that life or its ending may bring. So let us go the next steps together and hopefully emerge, as we usually do, full of love and ready for the next phase of life. And of course, I must give thanks to my dad. Was he perfect? Of course not. But he strove to be part of and to influence the most important parts of my life. My dad's death represents the last of my giants, with the other giant being my dad's older brother Tim. They were the same in many ways, but also completely different, opposing sides of a buffalo nickel, if you will. Those two giants stood tall and cast long and influencing shadows in my life, even from a distance, and they forever will. They taught me the joy of competition in literally almost everything. Pac-Man, then Super Pac-Man, Papa Shots for tickets, to paper wads in a waste can, actual basketball. Undefeated, by the way. Games with my son Ian excluded, of course. Golf, rock skipping, the art of boxing out in the elevator. Literally 1,000,001 versions of catching an object being thrown at you. For points, of course, word games, card games, board games like Risk and Monopoly, darts, pool, and now the infamous train. These are all just games, of course, in one form or another, but they offered a time when maybe lessons could be learned about business or politics or sports, or a time when a story how they conquered the world could be heard, or just a time to hang out. Those were the times when I learned about life and the times I will miss. A honky-tonk bar in Ozark, Buddy Guy's Legend Club in Southside Chicago, a shebeen in Soweto, South Africa, a wine cafe in the heart of Paris, a private casino in Marble Arch, London, a cocktail party on Capitol Hill, or the Cotton Club in Harlem have in common. Well, beyond local music, beer, and cocktail peanuts, that is, they're all places my dad would easily walk into, strike up a conversation, and be at ease. He was able to connect with people from literally all parts of this world and find a way to relate. That drinking-related word association brings me to the last thing I have to thank my dad for, and that is his legacy within me. That is the gift of Africa and what it represents in my life. It wasn't a gift necessarily crafted with me in mind, but I have and will reap the benefits of it for my whole life. For those who don't know, I was born in Kampala, Uganda, so that fateful decision of Paris, Kampala, definitely weighed heavy in my life. During one of my dad's posts, his first overseas as a diplomat, my brother Trevor was born in Pretoria, South Africa. These are experiences imprinted on my life on how to see people and cultures that are different than mine. They gave me a perspective that just can't be taught. It has given me my North Star that I hope to be able to pass on in some ways to my kids and those that I affect. So with that, Dad, I love you and say until we meet again.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was wonderful and powerful, and it spoke to all of us, and I'm sure your dad is sitting up there approving. So thank you so much. Let me now invite Renee and Trevor to come up for the final word. Renee, Trevor?
Hi, everybody. I am just so grateful for seeing everybody here. It's a huge turnout, and I'm amazed. Excuse me if I cry. Jane Harmon, thank you so much for hosting this memorial. Mondi for just doing an amazing job. I really appreciate it. For seeing my brother and my sister-in-law and my niece and my nephew and my best friend from nursing school in 1970, we won't say, on the screen over there has just been wonderful and just added so much to this memorial. I just wanted to thank Vivian and Nick and Gabby and Papi and Liz for speaking. Just such beautiful words and just for meaning so much. Johnny, you encapsulated his life and your friendship has been amazing. And Anne, thank you so much, both of you. Again, just a big thank you to everybody for coming out to honor my husband, to honor my Steve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renee. We're the ones who should be thanking you, Chris and Trevor, so thank you. I'm going to call you back, the three of you, to come back up to the stage. Sorry. We wanted to present to you, and we have one of these for each of you, is that Wilson Center slide framed of how much Steve meant to our Wilson Center family and to the work that we do here. So thank you so much. So that's one. We also pulled together a book of remembrances that contains the remarks that were made here today. We received an outpouring of tributes to Steve from around the world. And as much as we appreciated them here at the Wilson Center, we felt that those rightly belong to you and the boys. And so you will find in here not just the remarks, but also the many tributes that came into the Wilson Center via social media and over email that have been included in here. And so we wanted you to have this.
Thank you so much.
And so we will. And we have a few of these that you can share with family as well. So just wanted to make sure you had that. And we'll put this back in here. All right. So that's fine. Thank you so much. We have one for you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. No, thank you. And for the rest of you, because I know you share these same sentiments, we do have a printout as a takeaway that we will have out in the reception area for you to take if you would like one. Let me conclude by thanking all of you. It is just absolutely amazing to see a full auditorium of people from all walks of and parts of Steve's life here to help us celebrate him. He would have loved this. And I just absolutely, absolutely thank all of you for coming here to do that with us. I join Renee in thanking all of the speakers. Thank you for your powerful, on-point, personal, yet all of us recognize what you were talking about that was so special in this individual that we all had the honor and the privilege of knowing. So thank you so much for coming here and helping us to celebrate and honor Steve. I also want to thank the Wilson Center team. The team, the entire organization has worked hard on this memorial because Steve was so special. And I want to conclude by quoting Hannah Quibo, who's a program associate in the Africa program. I had asked her to speak because I knew how much Steve meant to the Africa program team, both current and former Africa program assistants and associates. And she said she didn't want to speak. Her planning this memorial was her contribution to remembering Steve. That was an absolute privilege and honor for her to be able to contribute this. And I think that speaks to how the rest of the Wilson Center felt about Steve. People were in here late last night and early this morning, making sure we were ready. So to the Wilson Center team, thank you. And finally, again, to Renee, Chris, and Trevor, thank you so much for sharing this special man with us. Let me invite Renee, Chris, and Trevor to please come up to the stage, join us with the speakers on stage for a photo. And I want to invite the rest of you to please join us in the Wilson Center dining room, where we'll have a mini reception where you can sign a guest book that we will present to Renee and the boys, but also continue to remember Steve in that forum. So with that, can I invite the speakers and the family to please come up? And Anne, please come up as well.